I'm delighted to be talking to Klara Skrivankova this morning, who is head of the Europe Programme and Advocacy Coordinator at Anti-Slavery International. Klara is here to share her expertise during our conference on trafficking for severe labour exploitation here at the EUI. So Klara, according to the International Labour Organization, there are 20.9 million people in forced labour worldwide. What's the scale of trafficking for labour exploitation in Europe specifically?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the data that we have is not very good at the moment, and it's down to a number of things. First, labour trafficking isn't necessarily identified everywhere, but also the way data is collected in the European Union differs. So, for example, you get countries where the only time a person is identified as a victim of trafficking is after a successful prosecution, which of course happens in very few cases. So the numbers differ from tens of thousands to even more, but it's basically estimates. If you look at a country like the UK, we estimate we've got between 10 and 13,000 people in a situation of modern slavery at any given time, and that would include both labor exploitation and sexual exploitation. And just last year we had 3,200 and I think about 60 people identified as potential victims, and about half of those would have been victims of labor exploitation. So you can potentially extrapolate, but we are talking about tens of thousands of people within the European Union.
Do we know what kind of form this exploitation takes?
It takes many forms. There are people who are exploited in formal industries, so agriculture, fishing, very often for those countries that have coast, home care, for example, that's a rising concern, construction, agriculture. I've probably already mentioned agriculture. It's basically any industry where there is a high percentage of migrant or temporary or seasonal labor. They are the industries that are at risk. But also there are people who are exploited for criminal activities, so forced to beg, forced to steal, and sometimes even forced to produce drugs. And that would also fall within the sphere of labor exploitation, but of course it's a little bit of a different phenomenon than exploitation, for example, in agriculture.
So it's obviously a huge issue. What are sort of the key challenges that European member states themselves will face in improving the situation? Well,
there is a number of challenges. One of them is certainly the rise in very negative anti-immigration agenda, which fuels negative sentiments against migrants and at the same time creates conflicts in policies. Because according to the EU legislation, if you're a victim of trafficking, whether or not you're a migrant, you are entitled to protection and assistance. At the same time, there is a push to regulate and to investigate immigration offences. And if you have a victim of trafficking that has been made irregular by their traffickers, they're unlikely to come forward if the result might be for them to be deported or detained. So the challenge is to manage all the other policy areas that might potentially undermine trafficking efforts. The other challenge is, of course, resources, but also a lack of awareness and knowledge amongst law enforcement. You still find cases of specifically labor trafficking that are not identified because they're considered to be a civil dispute. The fact that a worker might walk into a police station and say, I haven't been paid, they're often sent away and say, well, that's not our business. That's not a criminal offense, without being asked, well, why haven't you been paid? And how long have you been working? And what are the conditions? So there is a big piece still around awareness raising and really encouraging and empowering law enforcement to be able to do their job.
Mm-hmm. So are there specific positive actions that you think need to be implemented to improve the situation? Are there any cases that are doing it particularly well?
It's difficult to point a finger at one country. There are elements of good policy in some countries, better than others. For example, if you take the example of Belgium or Netherlands, they've quite active and proactive labour inspection that works in favour of identifying working conditions of workers and assisting workers. In other countries, there is no labour inspection or very limited labour inspection that looks mainly on health and safety issues, for example, so they are unable to pick up issues around labour trafficking. There are also good examples of countries who are trying to ensure that victims of trafficking have long-term prospects and long-term support, so ensure that they are able to, for example, stay regularly in the country and work. But there are others who are still not developing proper protection and assistance programs and literally talk about sending people back within a very short period of time, which often leads to their re-trafficking.
So the conference here today and yesterday has focused a lot on domestic work. Why is this a particularly important subject, and how will it affect policy, do you think?
Domestic work is one of those areas that is often very overlooked. We know a bit more about trafficking in agriculture, in the formal industries, but domestic work happens in private sphere, often behind closed doors, where traditionally state is not allowed or not welcome, so state intervention doesn't happen there. Also, domestic work is not necessarily connected to big organized crime in the way that other forms of trafficking often are. And that means that there is no focus on this particular area. It's also predominantly and traditionally female sphere, so there is a whole gender dimension. And there is often also confusion over what is a family setting, what's not a family setting, what the role of the state should be in that. So it's really important that the conference is actually highlighting some of the hidden aspects, but also some of the key issues in the domestic work sector, which stretches just beyond the sort of household help to private care arrangement, fostering, au pairs. So there is a huge area in which people are providing domestic service, and often it's an essential service, such as childcare or care for the elderly or disabled, yet it's not recognized often as formal work, and therefore escapes the scrutiny and the regulation that other areas of the labour market might have.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Klara, for your expertise.
No problem.